this as large as possible so I can still see some videos, just because that's nice. And it makes me sure that I'm not speaking into the void, which I approve of. So thank you guys so much for coming. I think this is a really cool project and initiative, so I will get relatively straightforwardly into it. There's a couple of things that I want to go through first though, which is like some indication, like which you're free to type into the chat, of like how long you've been debating in BP, and like debating or judging, if you have experience in other formats or something like that. Like not everyone has to answer it, but like just some indication of where we're at, just to make sure that I adjust a little. Okay, and we have a bit of a mix. That's actually very good, because I think then it's also like much nicer to learn from each other and stuff. You're on the same device, I assume? Yeah, okay. Right, then let's get started. So I think the most useful thing about burdens of proof as a concept, and I guess sort of the short elevator pitch for this workshop, is that what it allows you to do is be very, very efficient in terms of your prep time. And I think it also, if you are rigorous about it, allows you to massively improve your time management in speeches to make sure that you have enough time for the things that are really relevant, but also maybe cut down on things that aren't that important, and that therefore it's also much easier to improve. Because at the point where you've made a genuine assessment that something is relevant to the debate and you've done the fullest extent of that possible, even if it doesn't work, it's much easier to learn from that than if you did 20 things very shallowly, because at that point you don't know which of the 20 things could have been good to develop on. You don't know which of them were good ideas and bad ideas. This is, I think, a very effective way of learning as you go through tournaments, get feedback, etc. So a roadmap for today is, the first thing that we'll be talking about sort of is what are burdens / how am I defining burdens for the purpose of this workshop. I don't think this is like an absolute definition. Both in terms of the macro level, so what is the burden of your side or your bench in the debate, and secondly at the micro level in terms of what burdens of proof there are for an individual argument that you're trying to make. Secondly, we're going to go into how you can access those burdens. I think that will probably be the bulk of this workshop, because I think it's most often where people sort of miss things and don't go as far in their prep time as they probably should. And then I'll have some tips and tricks for how you can meet your burdens efficiently, for how you can make sure that you're applying the lessons of how you found your burdens in order to actually give a winning speech. In terms of definitions, and after definition slide, I think it would be very helpful to have like a short questions round if there are any questions. The first thing is like, how am I defining burdens? I think the basic idea is that they are the threshold that your analysis has to meet in order to be relevant in the debate, i.e. an explanation of how, for instance, in a feminism motion, you're on opposition bench to a feminist policy, you're arguing about backlash. Surely, backlash is only relevant if it meets your burden in the debate to some degree, and therefore is arguing why I should oppose the motion. If backlash is just something that happens orthogonally to the motion that would happen anyway or something like that, then it's not a specific reason against the motion. It is not meeting your burden, and therefore your analysis is not relevant. At the macro level, this will typically be something along the lines of your side is right, and then you rephrase that such that it has a more clear set of logical implications. In policy motions, this will almost always be the benefits of this policy are worth the harms or are not worth the harms or costs of implementing something. I think very, very few policy motions won't have this. Obviously, to some extent, you can rephrase this as this is just absolutely wrong, regardless of potential benefits. But in the end, that's still a logical way of proving it's not worth it, because then you're just saying the costs are so large that no benefit could ever measure up. In a lot of like more analysis heavy motions, it can often be sort of like a thing is better at doing something than another thing. X is better than Y. Fundamentally, in order to get to these, you just have to do a closed read of the motion. I'll give you some heuristics for how you can do an effective closed read of the motion in a moment, but basically this is sort of the definition, the working definition I'm running with for this workshop in terms of what a burden is. In terms of micro level, it winds up being sort of at a slightly lower level, what is necessary in order for your argument to be true. So not necessarily for your side, but one level down, okay, you have a claim such as this policy will generate backlash. What is necessary in order for that claim to actually be true and to be relevant within the debate? Obviously, these are to some extent quite different things. I find it helpful to conceptualize them together because I think both of them wind up being the same logical structure applied to proving a claim. Just one is very high level in the sense of this motion is good, this motion is bad. A second one is this thing happens, this thing does not happen, which winds up being logically very much the same thing. I think this is also true to some degree for rebuttal as well, in the sense of there are burdens for your rebuttal to be effective, and you should meet those burdens when you are making an effective piece of rebuttal, to the degree that in the end rebuttal is just an argument flipped or a reason why a thing does not happen, which then also has to be proven logically in terms of argumentation. I will largely be focusing on it in terms of just constructive argumentation because I think that makes explanation easier, but just note that it probably also applies to rebuttal. I know I talk sometimes very fast. Please call me out on this if I do. Are there any questions on this definition thus far in terms of like what I'm talking about, how you would apply this to like a particular debate, anything like that? Okay, I'm just going to check the chat. No. Okay. Give it another second. Okay. Throughout the rest of the workshop, I would just suggest use like the reactions thing to basically place any reaction. And I will just consider that as like you have a question, and I will then take a break so you can actually speak. In terms of how you identify those and why that is useful, I think the major thing obviously is you want to read the motion very, very closely. The thing that I think most of you will probably have been told by coaches and also by any judge that you've had is you want to look out for like the spicy motion defining terms. Things like all, none, always, never, legalize all, nationalize all are always very clear indication of a burden in terms of, okay, you don't just have to defend the case where it's obviously a good idea, but you have to look at fringe cases as well. You have to look at whether a fringe case is something that your argumentation covers. Which I think is like relatively intuitive. So I won't spend a huge amount of time on it. I will have some examples on it in a moment. The second thing that I think is very important to look at in a moment is what degree of action is actually implied that you have to defend. One example of this is a lot of social movement motions will have something along the lines of the movement should propagate or the movement should say that a particular norm is true. So that the family is antithetical to feminism or something, like traditional family structures antithetical to feminism. This is different from that discussion by itself, insofar as at the point where obviously you're arguing about the movement making that attempt to convince people of it, that is a structurally very different thing from would the world be a better place if the movement succeeded at doing that thing. That can become a clash in the debate, but it doesn't have to, depending on the degree of success which people analyze the thing to have. So you want to look at that also as a part of your burden. So if you're trying to make an argument about whether the success of an attempt would be a bad thing, you first have to prove success, that it becomes a part of your burden if success is not implied in the motion. This is obviously specifically important with regard to actor debates, but also obviously with regard to like policy debates where the government is trying to achieve a particular outcome, because we don't necessarily know whether a policy will have the intended goal outcome. One example of this could be housing debates, where the argument is the government should remove such and such restriction on housing in times of crisis, with the implication of like there will then be more housing which people can move into, maybe prices will drop, etc., which I think is very common analysis for those things. The thing is obviously that then entails a sub-burden of why is the government successful at achieving this thing, which also becomes a part of your explanation in order to like make a successful argument. Similarly, on op, if your case is the government would be successful at lowering prices, but that's a bad thing, you still probably have to prove that they would be successful to the degree that you need them to be in order for your argumentation to stand. Thirdly, I think you want to very specifically look at what isn't in the motion and what isn't necessarily a part of the debate. This can be obviously to some extent things of like success versus attempt, but I think it's also questions of like what categories of things are not in the motion. So if you are nationalizing something that is relatively narrow but topically related to something else, be very careful that you're not claiming to include that other thing, or if you are doing so, explicitly include it in your MAC. Lastly, I think burdens are obviously sometimes significantly defined by mechanization. I have an example for this that will happen like in a couple of slides that I think makes it clear how specific mech can shift the burdens which teams have to defend or not. But basically look for, okay, if I was a really, really smart opening government team, how would I mech this? And what burden would that put on opposition to defend so that they would still have a case given that mechanization? One useful thing that I have found, which I think also applies to an example that I have in a moment, is to try and flip the statement implied to understand specifically what it is that the other side has to defend. One very classical example of this, I think, is like, this house would legalize all drugs. The literal opposite of this is obviously this house would not legalize all drugs, at which point opposition doesn't have the burden of banning all drugs. They have the burden of banning a good amount of drugs, which means that they can then pick and choose. And depending on how they pick and choose in leader of opposition speech, government then has to defend against the burden that that particular framework puts on them. Lastly, and I guess sort of continuing from the flip, if you were trying to be very strategic about how to interpret it from the other side, if you were trying to make the burden on yourself as low as possible, how would you interpret that, and what burden does that place on yourself in order to still defeat that, just to make sure that you are robust against different framings of the motion? A lot of this is very theoretical, so I will just very straight up jump into a couple of examples. This house would legalize all drugs. How would you mech this in order to screw over opposition bench? I might just randomly start picking on people if no one like volunteers. Okay, it's fairs. Pratik, how would you mech it? Also, apologies if I'm butchering names, by the way. I don't agree it's an up-heavy motion. Every time I see it at a tournament, it winds up being like 90% Gov wins. But to be fair, that's very specific context. I live in the Netherlands, so I guess we're just very used to drugs. Yes, I think this is a very good burden push on the opposition bench. They have to prove that not legalizing is actually effective at preventing the harms of drug use. I think this is a very good burden push. I think the other thing that I think I just gotten as a message, as a private message, is legalize obviously means we can still regulate. How would you regulate in order to be effective against challenges from the opposition bench? What would you do that is still within part of the motion, but is regulating and like useful for your side? Yep, limiting use via age is very good. One classic thing I've also seen is sort of like limit where they can be consumed. So make sure that you don't have like people taking them home to their kids and stuff. So those things. I think probably also you can be quite effective by just meching in, look, we will use all the money from this for like course, like all the tax money raised from this to make sure that we fund like addiction treatment and those kinds of things. Basically, I think like, indeed at the point where you push several burdens onto all and you mech relatively carefully such that massive overuse as a result of this becomes relatively unlikely, I think it's much, much easier. That obviously means that op is then in a very different position than just being able to say heroin is really bad though, and it should not be legal. Because at the point where you've said, one, there's a black market, two, we can limit the degree to which people take heroin on gov side, but you can't on op side because there's a black market. That means heroin is very bad, no longer meets their burden, even though probably technically prior to mechanization and framing, it would have. This is basically the entire thing that I'm trying to like show through this example. I will move on to the next one once I figure out how this whole thing works. Okay, this house would nationalize public transportation. What's a good gov case for this? Like just the headline for a basic gov case. Yep, I agree. This makes transport cheaper. I think this is probably a very good point. Yep. See, I think the third one is actually something that I was not expecting, but the first two ones, I think you can run them in, like, I think a lot of this you can basically run in PM speech, and then leader of opposition stands up and says, I agree, we should have a lot of public transportation that is run by the government, but like, we also think Flixbus is really cool though, and we would not like to remove Flixbus or nationalize Flixbus because it offers a useful additional thing that we don't think the government would offer. I'm not sure why preventing pollution is in the motion. It might be, I'm just not sure. Yep. The thing though is the actual motion primarily requires proposition to defend something that isn't the explicit statement, which is there should be no buses or trains run by private companies at all, which is a very different motion than from we would like to have a lot of public transportation run by the government. You actually have to defend removing everything else. Not cars. I think cars are not in the motion, but like you have to remove every other form of, to some extent, like shared transportation. Which means that you have to make very different argumentation, because at this point saying buses are really good, like buses being cheap is really good, is something that op can have too, and it no longer meets your burden. You have to prove why specifically private alternatives are really problematic, which means that you wind up with a very different set of analysis that would actually explain that. I wound up in this position, I think at Cambridge Women's or Oxford Women's over a year ago, where we realized this like 14 minutes into prep time for being OG. And I had to cram this analysis into PM speech with no preparation whatsoever and just try to make it up on the spot, / throw it to my partner, which was very unpleasant. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I'm not really sure why that's a profitable business model. The occupancy is very low. Like the thing is, you're not banning cars, right? That at that point, I don't think necessarily the environmental stuff works strictly, but it might. I don't know. Depends on how the debate plays out. Fundamentally, I think this is a case of like you should flip the motion as well, just to make sure that you understand what op is allowed to defend. In this motion, op is allowed to defend we invest a lot more in public transportation as the government. They just don't have to ban everything else, which means that you want to defend particularly against that. Motion that seems to pop up relatively frequently these days. This house would teach women to be selfish. What do you have to prove on opposition? I agree. Why wouldn't it be good for women's well-being? I mean, if it doesn't need to be taught, that's not an ob case, right? That's just symmetric. Like, if people are selfish anyway, what's the delta? If they don't adjust, what's the harm? What happens? I agree. I think the whole selfishness is something that sabotages you in life because you won't have social contact, etc., is a very good case for this debate. Proposition can really easily dismantle it, though, by one line of framing, which is, we will try to teach women to be selfish. We will fail, but in the course of trying to do it, we will teach them other valuable lessons that won't have the harms that you talk about, but will still have benefits for them. Basically, this is about capacity of the actor in question. Can you actually teach people to act in a manner that is significantly against what social norms are telling them to do? And if not, what does your attempt to teach them actually do in the debate? Oh yeah, I think we'll put the feminist movement in the bad light is actually like a case that definitely stands in this debate, like regardless of everything else. Like this is a case with very low burdens with regard to being relevant. This is also a very good case, to be honest. At that point, it becomes significantly more about how the actor would pursue that goal, and therefore what benefits and harms flow from that, rather than from the end outcome of would women being more or less selfish be a good thing. Basically, you can't defend or oppose end outcomes. You have to defend the process in question, given that the end outcome is uncertain. This is also a part of your macro burden in this debate. The last one is really weird. And for this one, I'm actually just going to give you the context because, I mean, I really didn't get it when it happened to me initially. So this would take a long time. I think the top half of this debate when I was in it at Amsterdam Open was very straightforward. It was opening government says, look, the market is currently failing to serve developing countries adequately. As such, they should take the benefits of being able to like sell drugs and bring drugs to their people cheaply. This made a lot of sense. It was well analyzed. It made lots. It worked. We in opening opposition go, no. If you do this, the market will actually serve developing countries even worse because no more innovation for them, because there's lower predicted profit from developing stuff for developing countries. It also it was a basically logical case in the context of the debate. I was like woefully ignorant at the time about the actual situation of pharmaceutical companies in general, because I read up on it afterwards, but that's not really an excuse for being ignorant at the time. But like it was the very predicted debate. What closing government does then, like immediately defeat both top half teams. They say, look, opposition doesn't just have a burden to defend that we should have like the drug patents not enforced. They also have to defend enforcing process patents for the production processes necessary for like every kind of pill or every kind of like other kinds of serums, which means that this is just a much, much larger thing that they have to run, because it means that huge amounts of like basically rent for these patents have to be paid whenever you're producing something, even when the like medicine itself is no longer under patent. Which meant that we had not met our burden in the debate at all, because we had not argued for that. We had no idea that what we were supposed to argue for, because they didn't give us a POI, and it was very annoying. But it was fundamentally something that we had completely missed in the debate. Looking at this, we misread the motion in that we literally misread the words in it. We didn't see patents for medicines, we saw pharmaceutical patents, which meant that we should have defended enforcing all pharmaceutical patents, not just patents for a component of pharmaceutical patents, namely medicines and like medical developments. This is one of those things that like seems obvious to me now. It definitely was not obvious to me at the time, but I think is basically just a case that you should be very careful to look at everything that is included in sort of header words in a motion to make sure you have your burden correct. Are there questions on any of the macro burden things? Because otherwise, I think we can move on to micro burdens. Okay. Microburdens. These are things that I think you may also have met as the layers of your argumentation. Basically, how your argument is robust to a challenge in the debate by adding more explanation, more analysis. Fundamentally, it defines what is most useful for you to talk about. Basically, this will almost always be one, what is essential for the truth of your argument? What are the necessary links in your logical chain in order for your argument to stand in terms of process? Secondly, what if this is even plausibly contentious? So you almost never will have to explain like gravity means objects fall down or people dying is bad, because we generally speaking will concede that. But if any part of your logical chain is plausibly something that the other side could try to rebut, you should explain it, because if a link in your logical or chronological chain is taken out, obviously this significantly weakens your argument. I see a question. I will get back to the question probably at the end, because it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily fit within the direct branch of this workshop right now. In terms of what you will almost always have to defend, especially if you're making a consequential argument, but also if you're making a principal argument, is the typical 4 microburdens to every argument, which is a thing happens, something is in process, something is a direct consequence of the motion. This happens only as a result of the motion and not just sort of exogenously caused by some other process. It is good or it is bad, depending on whether you're in opposition or in proposition, by some mechanism by which we choose to assign a good or bad value to something. And that mechanism by which we assign that value is true in general and applicable to this situation. Sometimes these are not going to be all super significant to their argumentation. For instance, if your argument is very directly related to the motion, or if it is literally, if the process in question is literally just the thing that is in the motion is really, really bad, probably you don't have to defend that it happens because it's directly in the motion. You don't have to defend that it happens uniquely because, again, it's directly in the motion. But you probably have to do a lot of work to defend why it is by itself, without any consequence or attachment, good or bad, because most of the time CAs don't set things that are like, this house would murder all the babies, because that would make no sense, which means like in those situations, though, you probably would be able to go straight into like, on principle, this is a bad thing. Here's why that principle is true. Here's why that principle is applicable to the state murdering all the children. Sometimes people miss these. The ones I've put in italics, namely the thing happens uniquely only under the motion and not otherwise, and secondly, that their evaluating mechanism is true and applicable, are often forgotten and they make teams worse. They're also often room for like extension in the BP debate, insofar as almost any closing team, if you see that your opening half has not met those burdens, you can fill it in and you can steal their argument, because the argument is only really relevant and useful to the degree that all of these burdens are met. If they are at all contentious and top half didn't do it, one, I would suggest doing it for extension, but also if you're in top half, you want to not leave that extension for a team in the closing half. How do you identify this effectively, and sort of how do you break it down? I think a thing happens winds up being basically, obviously, sort of like your general analysis for processes. Things that you almost always have to defend is, one, the actor doing a thing has the capacity to generate that outcome. This is supplemented by people will respond to the actor acting in a particular way in the manner that you predict, and that you also then have to make more likely by like filling in bits and pieces of analysis. And lastly, this outweighs contrary trends in terms of why that thing otherwise doesn't happen. One example for this is a debate I was in relatively recently, which was a training debate using the Athens semis motion of, this house believes that victims of atrocity should emphasize the banality of evil narrative when interpreting their atrocity, roughly paraphrased. Closing opposition in that debate ran a case about how this specifically enables those communities to secure reparations and potentially punishments for the actors responsible for the atrocity. This requires the actor has the capacity to leverage that message. Yeah, I can try and send a motion. 1 second. again, this is a rough sketch of it. I think there's probably a slight wording difference. I can double check that though. Okay, I think it is roughly this motion. Okay. In that, you obviously have a burden on closing opposition when they're trying to make that claim, to explain why the actor has the capacity to, for instance, shape messaging around what happened to them substantially enough that they are therefore able to generate a political capacity for their demands to be met. Secondly, that the people that they are demanding those things from are actually to any degree open to and capable of meeting those demands. And thirdly, that it outweighs the reasons why that isn't currently happening. I think this winds up being where the op team in that debate had the most struggle, because they explained persuasively why when you claim banality of evil narrative, it's really, really hard to claim reparations, because it's very hard for the people in question to then admit that you deserve reparations because your claim is less, the claim of what happened to you is less extraordinary and less abnormal. All of this made sense. But the thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite doesn't also fall victim to those same problems that make it hard for people on government to claim reparations. Basically, it's quite important that you explain not just that there is a reason for your thing to happen, but that reason is the tipping point uniquely away from the thing not happening, given the fact that you've given reasons why it's unique to your side. Secondly, you want to explain uniqueness so that you have something exclusive, i.e., without the motion, the thing probably is not going to happen, or it is less certain to happen. I think sometimes people underestimate probability increases as arguments, but I actually think oftentimes they're quite good because they're usually quite reasonable and you don't sound like a conspiracy theorist when you're making the claim, which is always nice. In order to explain that, then you specifically have to explain why, when the motion happens, you are able to overcome that reason against. And specifically, I think why only the motion or uniquely the motion is able to do that, i.e. why op can't just counterprop something else and thereby achieve the same outcome. This is obviously something that you're not necessarily going to all be able to do, especially in Prime Minister's speech, because you don't necessarily know yet how op are framing the debate. You don't know yet what counterprop they're going for. But you want to make sure that somewhere within your team, both of these burdens are definitely met so that your argument can be true. Distributing that work, I think, effectively between speakers is quite useful, because obviously it doesn't really matter if something is entirely done within one speech. I strongly suggest, though, that you make a checklist between yourselves for what you've done and what you haven't done, especially in online debates. Obviously, there's just the possibility of writing to your partner, okay, I didn't do this. I didn't meet this part of our burden. You really need to do it. And I think it's useful to frame this in terms of burden rather than you need to say these 5 points of analysis, because it means that your partner has freedom to choose their own way of meeting the burden, which means their talents are more optimally used than if you just throw them analysis, which they may not be able to optimally deliver. But you're still giving them a clear goal set of what they're supposed to do with their analysis in order to achieve the result that you need to achieve for your argumentation to stand. Does that make sense? To the chat. Okay. Second thing, obviously, is sort of proving importance / proving relevance for winning the motion using the argumentation that you've delivered in terms of a process that happens. This winds up being two things. One, there is some way in which this thing is bad or good. I think this is possibly controversial. I think all arguments are principled insofar as caring about suffering or caring about consequences is also to some degree a principle. Therefore, if you're saying this policy causes a lot of suffering and therefore we should oppose it, that means that you are arguing it's bad because it causes a lot of suffering and we should care about suffering being inflicted. Usually, you don't have to prove why suffering is necessarily bad. You will have to prove, however, two things. One, that there is more suffering on prop side than there is on yours, which is sort of what you did in the previous step where you explained truth and uniqueness. Secondly, and this is the second aspect of this, suffering being important is one, true. There is some reason why we should care about suffering in the first place in the sense of we think it's important to protect people when they can't protect themselves, or suffering is just by itself an end bad, and therefore we should enact policies in order to stop it. And it is particularly applicable in this situation. So this, I think, is probably the one where you're going to be able to do the most principled weighing, because usually there's legitimate principles in order to support either side, right? Like maybe some side has more freedom, some side has more happiness, and something like that. You're not necessarily going to win on freedom is always better than happiness, or choices are always more important than happiness. You usually can win on which thing should the actor in question care more about, or which thing does the actor in question have a greater duty to afford to the particular people with whom he is interacting. I think this is something where you can usually do quite a bit of like effective principle weighing in terms of our burden is not necessarily to defend that this is good in every way, but it is good in the specific way that should be most decisive for the actor in question, is usually much easier to win and allows you to have a much more specific and lower burden than having to explain that there are no downsides. I think the second thing is, if you're running a principled argument or an argument that is not strictly consequentialist, you have even more of a burden oftentimes to explain why that would be something that is applicable. I think sometimes this is due to like judging suboptimalities where people are just trained to care a lot about about practical argumentation. But I think it's also to some extent reasonable in that at the point where we're letting in principles as opposed to practical material, there's like so many of them that if we were just going to let all of them count equally, then it would be impossible to judge. Explaining therefore specifically what your principle looks like, what parameters it sets up for evaluating reality, why that reality is better on your side than on the others, and why that should be the definitive reasoning for your actor to go one way or another, is fundamentally like going to be part of your micro burdens in a principled argument if you want that to be effective and winning. Broadly, I think for principles, most often you will have to spend more time on this slide. For practical, you will have to spend more time on the other slide, just in terms of what will be most contentious and where will you have the most struggle convincing the judge. But sometimes that's not true, and this is obviously just like a general guideline. In terms of applying this, I think we're going to go back to teaching women to be selfish and go back to running the argument about how it is fundamentally bad for women to become more selfish, because it will cost them social relations and therefore make it harder for them to like operate in society or something like that. Let's run through all the steps of that, starting from the first. What specifically does the actor in the motion have the capacity to do, and why does it generate your outcome? I agree. The question isn't, does the actor woman have a capacity to be selfish? Does the state have the capacity to teach it? Because that is the motion, not this house wishes all women were more selfish. Yep. I think presumably the way that you would go about this is doing things like the state has a lot of time that it spends with everyone, that basically you can set the curriculum for how people spend like 8 hours of their day. Presumably you can do quite a lot in terms of like manipulating their habits, implementing rewards for people who choose to be a certain way, like teachers praising you for making a particular choice when you are very young and open to influence, which means you actually develop those behaviors and as a result become more selfish as per the definition of selfishness. Second thing, other actors respond to it in a way that creates the outcome. So, okay, women have developed impulse to be more selfish. As a result of that, I'm seeing this already, I think, in the chat. This means they are, one, more likely to harm others. I think probably here you just want to like list 3 examples of where acting selfish harms someone else in your life. You pick any 3, basically. And they don't adjust to others around them, which means they are like harder to have solid social networks. Okay, fair enough. There's a contrary social trend, which is women are often told to be very selfless because it is socially valued. And also, you know, people usually appreciate people being selfless because it's a nice thing. It means that there is low conflict, etc. Why is this teaching more effective than the contrary trends? What is the reason why women would prioritize what they're taught over what other social trends tell them to do? Yep, okay, I have this in private message. Basically, oh yeah, and legitimacy of the state is, I think, one thing. The state oftentimes defines morals for others. I think there's a second thing, which is the degree to which people are, like, this is not the state engaging with one woman by herself, but also that this becomes a social norm across her direct field of reference. So her friends are more likely to also value this behavior because they are all experiencing the reward mechanisms, which means that the constraints on selfishness are no longer as present as the force in favor of being selfish, which means you actually develop this behavior. Therefore, you alienate your social circle. This happens uniquely. I think this is pretty straightforward through this motion. You don't necessarily have to do a lot of work on it. Why does it not happen without the motion? So for instance, if I was going to say, okay, this also happens without the motion because capitalism makes everyone selfish, which admittedly is contrary, but like whatever. Why would you say this is unique to this debate? Yep, I agree, exactly. Social narratives are largely anti-selfish. Most religious narratives are anti-selfish, but like you have to counteract them in order to generate this effect. With the motion, it does happen. See all of our analysis for why the teaching by the state actually overcomes the contrary incentives. As a result, it actually occurs. Wonderful. Let's go through impacting and the burdens that you have in order for this to be useful. This is bad because we're making an up argument for some reason. What is the metric by which this is a bad thing? Why is it bad? Like, I agree. Okay, women now have less social support network. Presumably, that does something. What does it do? Yep. I think happiness is probably a really easy way to like run from this, in the sense of they are going to be in the long run significantly less happy, which means that we've just generated quite a lot of suffering, which we should care about because it's generally speaking bad. I think the whole idea of like this generates backlash to feminism, sorry, this is in a private message, is true, but I think it's a separate piece of argumentation, at least possibly. I think it's possible to impact this case by that as well, but I would prefer to stick to the other bit. Yep, I think social mobility is another really good case. Like, to the degree that we want to increase equality between different genders, it's important for there to be positive social relationships, because social relationships are the most likely to make people value someone else who is disadvantaged relative to them as a person with their own like rights and contributions, which means they're more likely to advocate for them, those kinds of things. Why is happiness more important than, say, these women being able to make more choices that generate sort of like their individual position? So maybe selfish women are better at getting their career together and therefore are able to gain a lot of money, spend that money on feminist causes, spend that money on, I don't know, being able to experience a very luxurious life. Why is that less relevant than the degree of unhappiness and lost social capital for increasing like feminist movement? Yep, I think this is a very good point. Selfishness by itself won't do enough. Eventually ensuring happiness for women, ensuring that they're well tied into social networks that will take care of them and like actually give them like fulfill material needs, is incredibly useful. Oh yeah, I think unity is also like a really good framework from which to look at this. Like, unity is uniquely capable of offering this. All of these are the steps that you need in order to make the alienation case true and winning. Otherwise, it is relatively easy for another team to just attack one of these 4 burdens and therefore make the claims significantly less persuasive. Conversely, if you understand that these are the burdens that the other team has when they're making any kind of argument, and you just apply sort of, okay, which of these 4 have they not met? Okay, this is where I'm going to angle my rebuttal. You can also be significantly more effective and time efficient in terms of engaging with their cases. Are there questions on sort of the material that we just did, the example, etc.? Go for it. I mean, I think fundamentally, like, an impact is analysis. It's just the distinction that makes more sense for me is like truth analysis, where you're proving something happens, and you should care about it analysis or impacting analysis, where you're saying this thing is bad or good. To some extent, obviously, this will be appealing to analogy, where this thing creates women being alone and sad is obviously a process or a truth analysis, but it appeals to our emotion because it implies a thing of like, oh, women being alone and sad is bad in other cases, so I'm going to assume it's bad in this case as well. Fundamentally, this sort of, you should care about creating suffering because it is wrong to do that to another person, because it makes the world a worse place to live. Those kinds of things would be very classical impact analysis. Most often it will just sort of go to the point of, this hurts people more than the alternative. Or just going straight for the principle and like saying this is an illegitimate thing because it means that the people around these women are disproportionately harmed or something like that. Which would also, I think, be a legitimate case to run in this motion. Like, women being selfish creates harms on people who are dependent on them, e.g. their children. Like, there's no reason for that to be good. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yep, go for it. Oh, okay, that's fair. Fargati, can you quickly confirm that, just to make sure that I'm not skipping over anyone? Right, perfect. Okay, I'm really sorry. I was just like waiting for a question, but that's fair. Okay. To go knowledge effectively in debates and use it to improve speeches. I think the first thing is, in your speech, in your notes, and in your prep time, you want to burden for your side. And then once you found arguments that meet that burden, what are the burdens? The structure, like the 4-step structure that we just did, is one way of evaluating that. Given the fact that it's not always applicable, because some of these will oftentimes be just obvious for a given argument, means that you should probably treat it somewhat flexibly in order to make sure that you're not wasting your time. Flagging in your speech what the burdens for your side are, what the burdens for the other side are, is often very helpful. It's also something that you should be doing not just sort of at the start in order to make things hard for them, but also throughout the speech as you're meeting your burden, to make sure that it is clear, the judge understands it, and therefore often, like if you're in closing so that it's clear what you're contributing relative to opening. If you're in opening, so that closing can't go, they didn't do anything about that burden, we're going to win by proving that. The second thing is, and this is something I struggled with like quite significantly, especially prior to EUDC, but also sometimes still, which is to be hard on yourself, because sometimes an analysis is really fun to run and it's really interesting and it's really creative and you have all the mechanisms for it, but it's also not really meeting any of your burdens because it's something that's symmetric, or it's something that you don't have the way to prove why it's exclusive or something like that. At those points, I strongly suggest either finding a way to make it meet your burden and only running it if you do, or just straight up skipping it, because it's not useful and because it means that you're not spending that time on meeting your burdens, which means some other team in the debate will, either by rebutting you or by extending on you. Some obviously things aren't really like burdens, but they are really strategically important. E.g., if you're just doing quite a bit of framing in order to make sure that the judges understand the terrain in which the motion is happening. Yes, sure, not all of them will be explicitly part of burdens that you will have to prove, but it's still useful to do. However, I significantly suggest to keep this, especially if you're doing a constructive speech. Like in a whip, maybe this is different. But for a constructive speech, almost always, you want to be sure that you know how much of that you're doing relative to how much it does for your case. In my experience, people tend to overdo framing a little bit and underdo like the analysis that they need, because framing is oftentimes a bit easier and you feel more comfortable doing it, because meeting burdens is actually quite hard to do effectively and to do diligently. Try and push yourself to make sure that you're only doing framing as much as you can without losing strategic time. But even if you're choosing completely the opposite way and doing like a speech that is 6 minutes of framing, you want to be very aware what you're doing so that you can make an active strategic choice about it, as opposed to just being pulled into something because you had a lot of things to write down about it and then spending a lot of time on it. The thing I found most helpful for doing that is to just cross-check my notes very carefully and look into what everything that I'm writing down is actually doing. E.g., I will have a different color code where I'm underlining something if it is framing or if it is engagement. I would have a different color code for here's my burden headlines, and here's what I'm doing in order to meet that specific burden with like an arrow and stuff like that. Making your notes easy to access in terms of what you're doing with each part of your analysis in order to actually explain the burdens of your side and then later the burdens of your arguments is incredibly useful to make sure that you're making good strategic choices and that you understand whether at some point maybe you notice that you're spending too much on something, what you can skip and what you can't skip in order for your argumentation to still be relevant. I highly suggest making some form of visual distinction between things just to make sure that you can make that assessment even when you're speaking and you're stressed out and you have to make a time way off, because otherwise you'll just wind up not doing half of the things you really have to. Personally, I think it's really useful for constructive speeches that don't have a lot of engagement. So for like PM, leader of op, arguably like at the very least the member of Gov speech, to basically block out my sheet in terms of like first burden, second burden, third burden, fourth burden, my argument is done. And then maybe have like a separate sheet of paper for anything else I want to do in terms of engagement or framing. And then move on specifically to my burdens where it's very visually clear. Okay, here's all of my ways of proving this component of my burden. Here's a way of proving all of my ways of this, because that additionally makes it easier to know what you can skip. So if you've already done 2 of your mechanisms for proving that something is unique, and you see that you're running into a time crunch, you can skip your 3rd and 4th mechanism for that and instead do the stuff on impacting, just to make sure that you have done everything that you've done, which is much, much harder to do if your stuff is written just in the form of a narrative. Because if you're doing a narrative, it's very hard to evaluate which of the next things on your paper is more important or less important than the other. If you're categorizing things in terms of what they're supposed to do for you in the debate, it's relatively easy to prioritize, to skip, to focus, etc. How to deal with unfair burdens. So this might be a little bit of dicey advice. I think if the team is trying to push an unfair burden on you, the way that I usually deal with it is I repeat it really slowly. And then I say, really? Because it oftentimes works, because the judge doesn't like to be like lied to. And if they're pushing a very unfair burden onto you as another team, then probably you can just call it out. Alternatively, if you're trying to be slightly less sarcastic and more polite, which I highly recommend, you can also just go into like minutia of like, the motion implies this. There is no reason why it has to imply that, given the fact that we can also interpret it like this. I don't think you should spend huge amounts of time on it most of the time, because if it's an obviously unfair burden, the judge knows this, and you just basically have to point out, this is an unfair burden. Here is a single reason why it's unfair. Moving on to meeting our actual burden. I think it's really, really useful to try and make sure that you do this by being very clear about what you think your own burdens are and being charitable in the sense of, they've tried to make us defend this really ridiculous thing. Clearly, we won't do that, but we will try and defend a thing that is reasonable for them to still speak against. So basically, like trying to position yourself as the good people is oftentimes very effective in my experience. Does that make sense? If the burden of the debate or the motion is by itself unfair, most of the time, try your best anyway. If the motion really does not allow you a fair way to debate it, sometimes the CAs are bad. That's a thing. Sometimes you've overlooked a way that you can read the motion that is somewhat more fair. Usually, motions are somewhat fair to debate, in my experience. But obviously, there are exceptions. In those cases, I think it's useful to flag at the beginning of your speech, we think that is a really weird thing to make us defend, but we will still do it in these and these ways, because it makes it clear that you're not necessarily super down with it and that there is potentially some issue there, but you will still get credit for whatever you do in terms of defending it. When is it absolutely justified to utilize a soft burden? I think it's usually justified to use a soft burden if you can. Like a soft opt to a case is almost always justified. It's not always strategic. In the sense of, I think sometimes when you're trying to go for a very, very soft framing of emotion that also makes your own benefits or your own side of it really, really small, which means that if you've overlooked anything on the other side, they can easily outweigh you. And that winds up being very difficult. Additionally, if you're in top half, bottom half will take the higher of the burden and beat you by doing that. So it's possible. It's never a wrong thing to do, in my opinion, but it is something that can wind up not working out for you. Tips on how to read a tricky motion properly. I think the first thing is to counteract the impulse that you should be talking about arguments after 2 minutes of prep time. A tricky motion almost always will merit you just sitting there and talking about, okay, what does this necessarily mean for 6 or 7 minutes? Because that is a better use of your time than coming up with arguments that don't meet your actual burden. The way in which to do it efficiently is to go over, okay, what debate does the CA team probably want to see on this? What are the intuitive things that could happen? What is the good idea for the other side to understand this? And then to conceptualize how you understand it. And at the moment where you know very well how the other side would do it, that is strategically advantageous for them. So for instance, what is the soft op to this motion? That means that the other side has a really easy time defending that soft op. How do we defend against that? Oftentimes will get you to a very good understanding of the motion. The second thing is debating tournaments do allow you dictionaries. I've never had issues with English in my debating career. I'm not a native speaker, but I really enjoy English and I'm pretty comfortable in it. I still think dictionaries are great because sometimes the literal dictionary definition of the words will give you inspiration for what the motion is supposed to mean and what it is supposed to be about. So I highly recommend doing this occasionally, just in order to make sure that you're on the same page. Sample notes for a speech. I do not. Give me a moment. I might grab some in a second. Wait, but my speech notes are on paper. I've never written speech notes on the computer. I can try and take a picture of them and maybe post them into comments later on.
We do have a Discord server where you can drop any resources.
Yeah, then I will, I think, just do that because that's a little bit easier than just trying to hold things up. In fairness, my speech notes are also quite weird because I always I have a strong tendency to just use one sheet of paper and to just write relatively small black text and then occasionally underline things. But I do think they, in fact, meet what I was trying to express. So basically, you could just imagine this was maybe spread across a couple more sheets of paper. This is probably translatable to other people who don't share